Welcome to Bridging Chicago, a podcast that aims to connect our listeners to Chicago's business, community, cultural, and charity leaders.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Bridging Chicago. We're so excited that you're here joining us for season 6 of the podcast. It has been an incredible 5 years listening to stories from all of our business leaders from around Chicago, and we're so excited for another year of that, and we're thankful that we get to continue to do this. Today, we have two amazing people from Shenix, an organization focused on the Latinx community and resourcing them. And so I am really excited to welcome in Olga Camargo and Juan Avila, who are joining us to share about their story and about the story of Shenix. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Nathan, for having us.
Yeah, this podcast for me has been really great because I think that there's something in here for everyone. And I love your organization because even though it does have a focus on the Latin community, it really shows how if you uplift any community, like the entire population, the entire society really gets uplifted with it, and why it's good for us to invest in people. And so I'm really excited for people to hear about that. But since we are Bridging Chicago, we always like to hear people's Chicago stories. So Olga, if you can start and share with us your story of Chicago, if you were born here, if you moved here, just what Chicago means to you.
Sure. Well, I was actually born in Los Angeles, but I was actually raised in Little Village. So Chicago is Mexican neighborhood. And I, did all my schooling around the Chicagoland area. I'm a Chicago public school graduate, UIC graduate. I got my degree in both business and English, master's in English at UIC. So that's my alma mater. And I've had the opportunity to be able to work within the community, also professionally as an investment advisor with my colleague here, Juan Avila. And we have, understanding like what our community needs. Having gone through, I want to call it what it is. I think I've become more comfortable with saying that, understanding what our sufferings have been, my own personal, my family's personal suffering, growing up, just in terms of, sometimes everybody's trying to get ahead. Sometimes we have committed like a lot of the same mistakes that many other families have. And so knowing what those, I want to say, some of that lack of financial education, bringing it to the forefront and making sure that people understand you're not alone when this is happening, because it happened to us, and we want to be able to give back. And so with Juan Avila, we have been working to try to meet those financial, educational needs that our community needs. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it's always humbling to us when people share their story very vulnerably and very honestly. And I think that, social media has created a culture where you want to share the good stuff, but not the challenging stuff. Or you want to see that maybe. And so I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that and about how that sort of taught you or what that taught you and how that shaped what you do now. And so we're excited to hear about that. Juan Carlos, why don't you give us your Chicago story and what brought you here?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And again, thank you for having us. It's really interesting because I think, listening to Olga's story is like we each, and Nathan, listening to a little bit of your story when earlier when we were meeting, we all have our own unique immigrant story, right? And I think and it's all brought us to this place right now. But my family's from Colombia, and my dad came here as an engineer and then was in the military here. So I grew up as an Army brat, living all over the States, all over the world. And I ended up in Chicago. I came out to the Midwest to go to college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then my friends were Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Chicago. I gravitated to Chicago, and now I've been here 30 plus years. So I would consider myself definitely a Chicagoan at this point, right? Hopefully you guys accept me into the fold. But my girls, I have 3 daughters who are CPS, all 3 of them CPS products, and and definitely very involved in the Chicago community, both through the work that Olga and I do around financial literacy and financial education on a day-to-day basis, but also the work that we do philanthropically in terms of our time and resources that we give back to the community. So just super excited to be here and share a little bit about our journey and the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I think if you've survived multiple Chicago winters, then you get to be a Chicagoan. So we'll definitely say that you both are Chicagoans. So thank you. Um, let's start here because you mentioned this, Olga, about the sort of failures of family, and not in the way of like someone doing something that was wrong, but in the way of if you were looking back, could you have done things differently, and would they have come, with a different result? And it's like, sure, you could say that about anything, but um, I'm interested to hear what you meant by that, by like what difficulties, what challenges your family kind of experienced that you think shaped what brought you to be concerned about financial literacy in especially the Latino community.
Sure. So, Juan Carlos and I, uh, as investment fiduciaries, we actually have been able to also, as we impart the financial education to employees at different organizations. When you get this, we help out with retirement planning. I mean, that's one thing. But the truth of the matter is that when you are in those rooms answering questions, you get a lot of questions. You get questions beyond the retirement planning, right? Which is important. But it takes me back to some of the things that my family personally, like had issues with, right? And I can remember, I remember when my dad was buying his first home and just didn't have the guidance that he needed, right? And he could have probably done things differently that wouldn't have, I guess, put him in a bad like financial struggle, because he could have been, had he sought that guidance, he would have been able to purchase that home differently, right? And so when you have salaries that are not ideal, and they're very much lower salaries, lower income, it makes a difference how you structure buying a home. And he could have been better off. My mom, on the other side too, she could have had better opportunities for planning for retirement when she had her business, right? And just knowing what you don't know, thinking about how she could have planned out, like, to have some kind of SEP IRA or whatever. You work so hard for the money and then you don't keep it, and then not understanding that monies that go into these smaller accounts, very inexpensive accounts, that they are also protecting that money that you have in place in retirement in case your business goes under. So things that we were, as a family, we could have been better off. We weren't doing what we were supposed to. Those are just some examples. We had other things that we could have done better. But I'm just thinking about how you set yourself up for the future, right? As a family, and whether or not you are seeking the guidance that you need to be able to do that.
Yeah. Juan Carlos, you want to tack on to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when Olga shares that story, and I've heard her share the story before, it takes me back to my childhood as well, and it's sort of, and I think it's and many of us have probably seen this where we've either seen our families when we were younger been able to know enough to know that they're being taken advantage of, or not making the best decision, not because they didn't have the capability to make that decision, but just not having access, right, to the resources, not having access to the information, right? And so both of those being taken advantage of and not making the best decision have to do with that lack of information, right? That lack of whether it's a language barrier or lack of access to those resources. And that's something that most of our parents coming here from other, countries, and even being born in this country, right? You experience. And so, and I know another part of it, which, growing up, when we talk about family, it's, I know both Olga and I, and many of the listeners here probably also, as, children and teens and young adults, were relied upon by the family to help make financial decisions, where
Mm.
we were in no position to do so, right? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and kind of acting as an intermediary in important financial decisions. And there's maybe there's potential trauma associated from that, but also just sort of maybe guilt associated with that. But just that's the position that many of us have been put on, right?
Yeah. There's so much to unpack just there. But what we've heard before from other people when we talk about minority communities is you just don't know what you don't know. And I think that there are people who have access to resources because they know that they're there. They know that they can go to certain people or places or organizations and get certain needs met. We talk a lot about scholarships, so that people can get educated, or do people actually feel like college is accessible to them? Um, I think that that's always very interesting, because sometimes it is like, are the resources available? And sometimes it is the resources are available, but do people actually know that they are there?
Mhm.
Right. And exactly to your point that you don't know what you don't know. Like Olga and I both saw this early in our careers, where we would go to do financial literacy education meetings at clients of ours who were organizations or companies that were putting together retirement plans for their employees, right? That are called either
Hmm.
401ks or 403bs, and and then realizing that there were people there who were native Spanish speakers, that worked at the organization, who had not participated in their company's retirement
Mm.
plan, where the company was offering a match. So
Yeah.
giving them money into their accounts because, and they had been there 20, 25 years, 30 years, because they didn't understand, what was being offered. Right. And so them missing out on all that potential benefit that would, help them in their, to have
Yeah.
to be able to retire with dignity, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Sort of a
Yeah.
question off of that, that I had earlier that you kind of worked us into. Olga, can you share with me, because you talked about retirement planning? Do people in minority communities, is retirement a thing? Do they believe that they can retire? They believe that they can work and then have a point to where they can sort of reflect on that and relax, and at the end of, when you're 65 or whatever, that they're going to be able to retire?
What's interesting is that I don't think there's enough conversation around the topic. I don't feel that it is discussed enough in our community. And I think people are just uh, really thinking about, you know, this year, next year. But the truth of
Mm.
the matter is that those are great, obviously, goals, right? What you're going to do this year, what you're going to do next year. But the truth of the matter is, you should also be thinking about what's going to happen when you do retire. The checks will
Yeah.
stop coming.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen? How are
Yeah.
you? And a lot of people, unfortunately, are relying. They're like, well, I don't shouldn't worry about it because there's Social Security. Well, number one, if you are entitled to a Social Security benefit, I mean, that's one thing, right? Because you may think you may have one coming, but you don't, right?
Yeah.
You have to see what that looks like for you. And then if you do get that Social Security benefit, I mean, just as and it's just an approximation estimation, but whatever you're making right now, think about you're going to be living, they're going to give you approximately like 40% of that.
Mm.
And that is that enough to keep up with your lifestyle? Is that enough for your bills? Is that enough for your bills in general? And a lot of times people don't realize that. And we also ask them to go on to the Social Security Administration government website to see if they're even entitled to a Social Security benefit, if and how much they project they would be getting. So it's a real reality check. And do you know when I ask people to do that, some people don't want to. I think they're afraid to look.
Yeah.
And that's not a way to you have to be more proactive with your future. And so I would say talking about it more is so necessary in our community. And to Juan's earlier point with that individual that I clearly remember, he was actually a janitor. And I remember that I thought to myself, imagine, I mean, I'm sure he still had like another 10 years to go or something like that before retirement. But imagine everything he had lost out on that was
Yeah.
due to him,
Yeah.
but only because he didn't understand. So luckily, Juan Carlos and I mean, our English is really good, like he says, and our Spanish is good too, right? So we try to go in and we try to go in through obviously speaking English, letting people know we speak Spanish, because sometimes I've noticed also like in the past, there was another organization that we were working with, and we had just gotten through delivering the information on their retirement program in English. And then I said, are there any questions? And then they said nobody raised their hand, because of course there's never a question, even though there should
Right.
be lots of questions at that point, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what we did is we broke it up, and then I went to a corner and I said, I'm going to hold something in Spanish over here if you have any questions. Sure enough, all these women, Latina women, picked up a chair and they went over by me and they formed a circle, and ahí les empecé a hablar español. I started speaking to them in Spanish and answering their questions. Like I said, some had nothing to do with the retirement.
Yeah.
So we just don't talk about it sometimes enough.
And that scene, I was there, and it was very impactful because Olga was holding court, but there's this group of women, and it's like we're looking at them, Olga and I, and it's like it's our tias and our moms and our hermanas, and they're there, and they want the information. They're writing stuff down, but nobody had ever explained it to them in their language. And to back to Olga's point around retirement planning and our Latino immigrant community, we have this hardworking immigrant community that's out there, and they're really good savers, right? But a lot of times they're coming to this country to say, okay, I'm going to work. My American dream is buying a home, and then their plans are, and then when I'm done working, I'm going to go back to Mexico, or I'm going to go back to Colombia, or wherever it might be. But then what happens is they have a family, and they have kids, and their kids are here, and their kids are staying here, and they have kids, and so all of a sudden, they haven't had that, because they haven't had the conversation right around, because their plan was, I'm going to go back and then I'll be able to, to live comfortably off,
Right.
What I have there, without realizing that, they're likely going to be staying here longer. So, it's having that conversation and opening up that dialogue.
Yeah. And I think that from what I've heard from people in other cultures, when you reach a certain age, it's not like you live in a nursing home or you have assisted living come in. It's like your family comes around you and takes care of you, your kids, their kids, siblings, whatever it may be. Like, you're not living alone at that point. You're usually with family. And I think that, is it possible we've sort of taken advantage of the fact that certain communities are going to make sure that their people are okay and that their people are cared for well, and so we maybe don't feel like we need to do that as much? Is that possible, or how does that play into it?
Yeah, I would say that does play into it, but I had, a personal experience where my mom was living in Florida, and my grandmother lived a very, very long life, but her last few years had Alzheimer's and was in kind of a home hospice with my mom. And just remembering my mom calling me and just being distraught and crying and saying, I'm not doing enough. And I had to remind my mom that, okay, you're in Orlando, you have a sister in Miami, you have a brother in New York, another sister in North Carolina, and then siblings back in Colombia. It's not like back when we lived in Bogota where everyone was on the same block, right? And everyone lived in the same community, right? And that's part of the challenge as well, is definitely there most definitely is still a lot of community within the Latino community here in the States, right? But it also, as we get to the second and third generation, it begins to disperse, right? And you lose that community, right? And that's a real big challenge.
Yeah, that's a great point. Olga, I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well.
No, for sure. I think that one of the biggest things that also, like, I guess, facing our community is, yeah, taking care of others. I'm in the sandwich, sort of like that, what they write about, that individual that is taking care of, like, my son who's in college, right? Freshman in college, and then also having to turn around and lead the care for my parents as well, because we are, yeah, like Juan said, maybe not under, well, I don't live with my parents under the same roof, but I still need to make sure, go visit them, make sure that where they're retiring, that they're okay. That it's a lot of pressure, I think, on a lot of us right now to take care of our communities, because I still have to take care of myself, right? And take care of, like, my husband. I mean, we take care of each other, right? But securing our future as well.
Yeah,
So there's, like, a lot that has been placed, I think, on key individuals within our community. And I also want to say, and I'm going to call it out, I think Latinas bear the brunt of it.
yeah,
I think Latinas are the ones that are primarily looked to for overall well-being of the Latino families,
mm,
especially when it comes down to helping make financial decisions, informed financial decisions, right? And without any of the financial background, right, that you would need to be able to make those decisions. So, of course, I think that a lot of people will say, like, well, Latinas are just, they're just nurturing. We are. I'm not saying we're not. We are nurturing, but at the same time, it's like, when you think about that second generation, first generation, even here, like myself, like, and second generation, like my son and other generations that come, they're getting more acculturated to the American sort of, like,
yeah,
way of being, which is, I want to not just, like, graduate from college. I also want to be able to, get a good job and progress, advance in my job, right? So
yeah,
there's also that other thing that they have to deal with themselves personally.
yeah,
And some of all that got exacerbated during COVID, and
Mhm.
especially hit hardest, right? You know, COVID hit everybody, but it hit certain communities harder, right? People of color, LGBTQ, plus children, young adults, but women, right, as well. And for Latinas, to Olga's point is, they've been juggling prior, right? That juggling in terms of their children, their parents, but then also their in-laws. And Olga and I were just having a conversation about just over the holidays, right? And they went in to check in on the in-laws and make sure everybody was okay there, because people were in other parts of the country, right, or out of the country, right? So it's not only juggling your family for Latinas, their children, their parents, but also their spouse's parents quite often.
yeah, yeah. And I think that there is sort of this, we take advantage of what stability provides in our lives, and the sort of security that comes around stability, in that when you don't have to worry about certain things, um, when you're not living in a food desert, and by that I mean you have access to healthy choices when you're going to purchase foods, when you're not worried about safety, and when you're not worried about, like, can I go to the police and ask them for help and they're going to believe me and trust me and help me. When you just have a lot of stability around you, I think that we sort of don't always understand what that provides for families and for people, when they can just worry about, okay, how am I going to thrive? What do I want to do so that the life of my child is better than mine? Because I think that's what every parent wants, no matter what life is like for them. They want better for their children. Um, but when there's certain things that you don't have to worry about, I think then you can start to think about, okay, well, what is life going to look like when I'm retired? What is life, how are my kids going to go to college? When you're not worried about how are my kids going to get to school because it's not safe enough for them to go to school, but you're saying, okay, my kids are going to go get straight A's. How do I get them into the best college we can get them into?
Yeah, to your point, right? There's the regular stresses of that. You could look at this topic, just from a that 35,000 foot level and say, okay, you've got to save for retirement, and this is how much income you're going to need, and everything else. But then there are those other pressures and stresses that come in that are part of daily life, which is safety, housing, the hunger,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
loneliness, everything else that impact our entire community, right? So how not having the right information or literacy like puts people behind the eight ball, where they're trying to manage through all these other stresses to begin with, just to get that stability that you're talking about, to be able to make those other good decisions, right? But it's
yeah,
sort of like, if you're not even getting that info, then you don't even have that option to make those decisions, despite all these other things that you're trying to navigate and manage through.
yeah,
Yeah, I have to say that, and I'm in the financial industry, and so is Juan Carlos. And it's amazing how much we learn about what's out there, like every single week. We're like, trying to stay abreast of what's happening. And the truth of the matter is, you have to go seek out the information, but you need to know where to go seek it out. And even for us, we try to learn about things sometimes outside of our wheelhouse, because some people may ask for things that I would not know about, but I do have other people that I can knock on the doors so that they can help
mm,
out those individuals. So seeking
mm-hmm,
out other resources for those individuals that are asking for about questions regarding, hey, I need to sign up for Medicare, and I don't even know like what program to go sign up for. So I know who to go to for those things, because and again, and I'm in the industry. So imagine everyday people
yeah,
that are going about like their own business,
Yeah.
going to work, doing what they need to do, and then they don't even think about this. Imagine how much we're learning. Imagine how much they can learn about things that can make their life better. And
Yeah.
that's what
yeah.
Shenix is about. It's about helping people, especially Latinas, but anybody can use it, to make their life better.
And you have a
And we
really interesting perspective because being female, I think, is very in this industry, in the finance industry, full of finance bros as we know them. I think is very it provides a perspective that that has to be very interesting. And I want to get to that. Juan Carlos, I want to make sure if you want to piggyback onto that before we move on.
Yeah, just to Olga's point, like Olga and I were having a conversation prior to this call that so Congress just passed this Secure Act 2.0 that the president is waiting to sign, and it's these huge impacts and benefits that are coming to retirement plans, such as
Mm,
automatic 3% enrollment and auto escalation in terms of the savings every year, and required savings and changes. And to Olga's point, like, we're learning about, because that's happening right now. The president's still waiting to sign it for it to get into law to impact next year. But the average individual, right, isn't hearing about that. So then how do we
yeah.
then our responsibility, Olga's and mine, and through Shenix and the work that we do, is to go out there and to be able to share that information with them.
Juan Carlos, Olga, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We have so much here, and there's still so much more to share, and we don't want to lose any of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this into a two-part episode. So this will end part one, and we want to make sure that you come back next week to catch part two with Olga and Juan Carlos, and we will continue to talk about financial literacy, especially in the Latinx community, and sort of what that looks like. And we'll focus on their work with Shenix. So be sure to come back and listen to part two next week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Bridging Chicago, as produced by the SATC Solutions Center. Nothing contained in this podcast shall constitute financial, investment, legal, and/or professional advice. No professional relationship of any kind is created between you and the podcast host or guest. You are urged to speak with your financial, investment, or legal advisors before making any investment or legal decisions. Furthermore, the opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the opinions of SATC Solutions Center, SATC Law, or any of its employees. This podcast is created by the hosts and guests' individual capacities. All opinions on this podcast are or have been rendered based on specific facts, under certain conditions, and are subject to certain assumptions, and may not and should not be used or relied upon for any other purpose, including but not limited to, or use in or in connection with any investment investment purposes or legal proceeding.